So we have been working our way hold on, up through a few albums of Rabbi Baruch Chait. And that was from a live performance posted on YouTube by Project Inspire of Rabbi Baruch Chait with a band. And when I heard him sing, just him and a guitar, at a little gathering a few months ago, he told the same story that he just told prior to the moment in the video that I shared with you in the opening during the countdown timer. And I was reminded of it because I posted Moshe Storch singing this morning during our Hallel for Rosh Chodesh. So Chodesh Tov, we just welcomed today's the first day of Tammuz, the new Hebrew month of Tammuz. And when we celebrate Rosh Chodesh, we sing Hallel. And Moshe Storch can always be counted on to sing a beautiful Hallel. And when he came to these verses in Psalm 118, he used that melody, at least for the first half of the stuff that I shared this morning on our Facebook page. But actually, I'm going to pick it up just a couple of verses before that. Here in Psalm 118, what Rabbi Chait was just singing. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of God. God has indeed chastised me, but it did not give me up to death. Open for me the gates of righteousness, and I will enter them and praise God. This is the gate of the Lord. The righteous will enter it. I offer thanks to you, for you have answered me, and you have been my deliverance. Now, why were those words so meaningful to Rabbi Chait that he created this song around them? He's been writing songs that have become standards in the Jewish world, especially in the ritual praying Jewish world, but also the very famous song Kol Halom Kulo, The World is a Very Narrow Bridge, taken from words of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, which now totally secular soldiers in the IDF are always singing as they're going off to their army service and even up to battle. But this song, Peacefully, Open for Me the Gates of Righteousness, early in his career, he was in Baltimore where he lived, teaching in a yeshiva, and he would just regularly get together with other Jews and rabbis and students and have a kumsitz and sing. And there was a boy whose father would bring him around to those singing sessions, especially Motzi Shabbos, I think, like Saturday night. And the boy had a terminal disease, tragic situation. Not only was he dying, but he was in pain in the latter days of that disease. And the only thing that gave him relief was music. And particularly being around people singing together. And so his father always brought him to these sessions of Rabbi Chait, and everybody really felt for the boy and for his father, and they welcomed him in. And after he'd been there several sessions, the boy said to Rabbi Chait, "Could you write a song for me?" It's not so easy just to write a song on demand, but okay, in the situation. So Rabbi Chait said, do you have a verse that you want the song around, that you want the melody built around, a nigun, a melody? Do you have a verse to inspire the melody, as it were? And the boy said, I've been thinking about these words. I've been thinking about these words. I shall not die, but I shall live and recount the deeds of God. God has indeed chastised me, but he did not give me up to death. Open for me the gates of righteousness. I will enter them and praise God. And he wasn't looking, obviously, for a sad song about the looming end of his life, but for a song that acknowledged where he was and the pain and would lift him up. What an incredible song that is. I just love it. Peacefully, Sharet Tzedek, ay, ay, ay. Ah, da, 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 ay, ay, ay. I'm not one that can remember melodies well, but I hope that I can, summon that melody into my mind anytime I'm looking for it till the end of my life. Rabbi Baruch Chait, also part of the Hallel that we sing today on Rosh Chodesh. Who's with us on a Thursday evening for a spectacular page? Sometimes we get pages that are so technical and legal and, case after case after case of difficult variations on a theme just to explore a law and hypotheticals that could never happen. And then sometimes we get a page that's so real world and stuff going on in the real world and real relationships and how people deal with each other. Great page today. Who's with us? Yehud in South Carolina, Paul in Chicago, James in Annapolis, Shandor in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, John in Scotland, Paula in the Great Northwest, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey, Renee in Indiana, Lucy in Minnesota, Tom in PA, David in Indiana, Lewis, actually Karen in Northern California, Rick loves the story, Paula's putting in a bunch of hearts, Aoife in Florida, Lynn in North Texas, Michelle in Washington. Welcome, everybody. Okay, let's get to it. Where are we? This is page 115 here in Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud. These are the laws of levirate marriage. We are in the penultimate chapter, chapter 15 of 16. And this tractate ends on page 122, and we're on 115. Here in this chapter 15, we return to a topic we first encountered in chapter 10. Generally speaking, these are the laws of levirate marriage, but we're also getting laws of marriage that can impact on a levirate marriage when a man dies childless, leaving a brother and a widow, and they have an obligation to marry each other and produce an heir for the man that died, or perform chalitza, and then they are free from that obligation. Here in chapter 10, we saw that if a man went on a trip and he died, and so if two witnesses come and they say, we saw that man die, now his wife is free. She is a widow and she's free to remarry. Or if the man died childless and left a brother, she's free to perform yibum with the brother. Or if not, she has to perform chalitza. But what if only one witness came? And we couldn't, in a legal fashion, thoroughly establish that the husband was dead. But if there's no witnesses and that the husband is never proven dead, that woman is stuck. Because, we never know. The husband might show up. There's no statute of limitations, and she'll never be able to remarry. So when there's at least one witness, the sages rule that, okay, she can go to a court and get a ruling that based on the testimony of one witness, she's free to be remarried, but she undertakes the risk that if the husband actually is alive and returns, she's going to have to divorce the new husband, and she'll be forbidden to the first husband because she was with this man in the meantime. That was chapter 10. Here in chapter 15, we're looking at, what if the husband and the wife traveled together and then somehow he disappeared and she comes back and she says, my husband died. Now, if she saw him dead, no problem. But if she testifies that they were in circumstances where he surely died, but she didn't see the corpse and bury it, then the sages are going to be a little bit hesitant because she's not only a single witness. Light the candle. Nina was reminding me. Not only is she a single witness, but she's an interested witness, right? That if the husband is not established as dead, then she can never remarry. So they're going to be very careful when they examine her. And if she says, it was a situation where he was surely dead, that's going to be very, very suspect testimony. They're going to be very careful before they believe her. Now, we saw yesterday that when they left on that journey, the husband and wife were at peace, and it was a time of peace in the world, or at least in the land that they traveled to, then her testimony is believed. But if the husband and wife were fighting, so we have reason to believe that she hated this man, then her testimony might not be believed. And if they went to a place that was at war, where she would have sort of good reason to believe that he was killed, let's say, he was in a building that got bombed, God forbid, or that collapsed, and situations like war, as we saw yesterday, a famine, or a plague, or like an outbreak of snakes, or a rock slide, in all these situations where she didn't actually see him dead, but he was likely to have died. So actually there, her testimony is not believed because he might not have died. All right, we pick it up at the bottom of 114b. a dilemma was raised before the scholars. If she, the wife, maintains that there is a war in the world, right? We don't believe her if there's a war in the world. But now she says there's a war in the world. In other words, if the court was not aware of a war in that place that she's returning from, where she went with her husband and she's saying that he died there, but the wife comes to the court and claims that there was a war in that land, and then she went on to say that her husband died in this war, what is the law in this case? And the first question would be, well, why is that a question? We just said, if there's a war in that place, we don't believe her. But what's different here is that she's the only witness, not only of the husband's death, but of the fact that there was a war in that place. Ancient times, the news didn't travel so quickly. The only one that knows that there was a war over there is her. So in that case, do we say, why should she lie? If she knows that her testimony is not believed, if there's a war going on over there, and she's the only one that knows there's a war going on over there, and she tells the court that there's a war going on over there, which would seem to undermine her testimony, that's actually a reason to believe her. Because why would she lie that there's a war over there now that fact comes to undermine her own testimony? And the fact that she's honest about it actually increases her credibility. And so we call that, why should she lie? Do we say, why should she lie? In other words, if she was lying, she would have issued a more advantageous claim. Since she herself informed the court that there was a war, which undermines her claim that her husband died, there is no legitimate reason to suspect her of lying. Because if she wanted to lie, she would have said there was peace in the world. She's the only one that knows there was a war. If she was a liar, she would have lied not only about the husband dying, but also about the fact that there was peace in that land. And she didn't. So that's one view. So therefore we should believe her. Or perhaps it can be argued, since she has maintained that there was a war, and this claim of hers has already been accepted with regard to her report concerning her husband, she will say what she imagines to be the case. And the argument of why should I lie does not come and undermine the established presumption that there was a war. So the Gemara cites a Baraisa in an attempt to resolve this dilemma, where she reports that there was a war. Should we believe her about her husband dying or not? Come in here. It was taught that if a woman comes and says, they set our house on fire and the house became filled with smoke, or they set our cave on fire to smoke us out, and she adds, my husband died and I was saved. According to this Baraisa, she is not deemed credible. Why? In this case, she herself related the entire story, and even so, her version of events is not accepted. And the Gemara answers that this is no proof. There, in the case of the fire, it is different. As one says to her, listen, just as a miracle occurred for you, and you were saved from the fire, likewise a miracle might have occurred for your husband, and he too survived, and unfortunately you were separated. You thought he was dead, but he survived. He was under the rubble. Later he came out, or somebody took him away to care for him. He was in a coma. You thought he was dead, but he wasn't dead. A miracle saved you from the fire. A miracle might have saved him from the fire. So that's why we don't believe her when she says we were in a fire and I was saved and he died, unless she produces the body. And that doesn't necessarily undermine the idea that we would believe her when she says there was a war in that land when she didn't have to provide that fact. So here's another proof. Come in here, a proof from a different Baraisa. If a woman comes and says, a group of Gentiles attacked us, or a group of bandits attacked us, and she adds, my husband died and I was saved, she is deemed credible. This indicates that her testimony is accepted due to the argument of, why would I lie? And the Gemara rejects, or says, not why would I lie, but why should I lie? Why should she lie? Why would she give an additional fact that would undermine her testimony if it wasn't true? And the fact that she's offering this kind of testimony suggests that generally she is honest. So the Gemara rejects this proof. There, in that Baraisa, that they were attacked by bandits or by Gentiles, Her testimony is accepted because it stands to reason that she is speaking the truth in accordance with the opinion of Rav Edi. As Rav Edi said, with regard to a woman, her weapons are upon her. In other words, a woman is generally not killed by thieves because the very fact of her being a woman protects her. They would most likely have their way with her and not kill her. Consequently, it is reasonable to assume that she is speaking the truth. And I'm not sure whether that proves that we should accept her testimony or not with respect to her husband died in a war. The Gemara relates, there was a certain man who got married. Hold on one second. So let me just say where the law eventually came out. She maintains there is a war. The Rima, citing Tur and the Rosh, holds that if a wife comes and says there was a war in another region and her husband died in the war, but the court had no knowledge of that war taking place, she may not marry ab initio. However, if she did remarry, she need not leave her new husband. Others claim that she must leave her new husband, as when she married him, she was a woman with regard to whom there was an uncertainty whether she was married. So you see that this same debate that the sages are having in the Gemara about this topic, they never really resolved it, and even the more recent poskim, the sages who make legal rulings, couldn't quite resolve it. Right? So they say, well, we don't believe it. We don't believe her if there was a war over there. But if she's the one that testifies about the fact that there was a war, then we might believe her. But we're not certain. So she should not remarry based on this testimony. But if she went ahead and remarried before she testified, then we don't make her leave the second husband. So that's where it eventually came out. But let's continue the discussion. So the Gemara relates, there was a certain man who got married. At the end of his wedding, a fire broke out in the bridal chamber where the bride and groom were standing during the ceremony. And his wife screamed and said to them, "Look at my husband, look at my husband." They went and saw an unrecognizable burnt man fallen down and the palm of a hand lying there. This is like an Edgar Allan Poe story. But it was an incident, a true incident. So Rav Chia bar Avin thought to say, this is the same as the case of they set our house on fire and the house became filled with smoke. Or they set our cave on fire to smoke us out. In those cases, we cannot rely on her claim that her husband died. And here too, we cannot rely on her claim that the husband died because there's like a burnt corpse there, but we can't be sure that that corpse is her husband. Even though she's saying, "Look at my husband," maybe she was looking at the burnt corpse and imagined the worst. But in fact, he somehow escaped and, disappeared because he was in a hospital in a coma, or he was taken away by bandits at the same time. Who knows? But we can't be sure that he died. Rava said, what are you talking about? Is this case comparable to those about where she said her husband disappeared in a fire that she was saved from, and so we can't rely on her testimony that he died? But here in this case of the wedding where there's a burnt corpse in the palm of a hand and she's saying that's my husband, how can you say those cases are the same? In those cases, she did not say, "Look at my husband, look at my husband." And furthermore, there's another difference. Here, there is a burnt man who has fallen down and a palm that is lying there. In other words, her statement is substantiated by facts. And presumably, they would have done, some kind of roll call of everyone that was present at the wedding, and if the only one missing is the husband and there's a burnt corpse there, that's pretty strong circumstantial evidence. And why didn't Rav Chia bar Avin accept her testimony and hold like Rava suggests? Why? Because in his opinion, a burnt man who has fallen down is not conclusive proof, as one might still say, perhaps another person came to the rescue and the fire burned him. And as for the palm that is lying there, perhaps the fire burned him and caused a deformity through which he lost his hand. And due to his embarrassment, he went and ran away to somewhere else in the world, but he is still alive. Consequently, Rav Chia bar Avin did not want to rely upon the testimony of the wife. New story. A dilemma was raised before them. In the case of one witness who testifies to the death of someone during a war, what is the law? The Gemara explains the sides of this dilemma. The reason that one witness is deemed credible when he provides testimony concerning the death of a husband is because the husband being alive is a matter that is likely to be revealed, and one would not lie in a case of this kind. So here too, one witness would not lie. In the case of the wife coming back and reporting that her husband died, why would she lie? I mean, if he really didn't die and she knew that, she runs a tremendous risk that he'll show up one day. Or perhaps the reason that one witness is trusted is because his account is supported by the fact that she herself is exacting in her investigation before she marries again. Because recall, if she relies on the testimony of a single witness and that her husband died, and then she remarries, and it turns out that she was wrong, that witness was wrong, that witness made a mistake, and then her husband comes back, she's in a terrible situation. She has to divorce the second husband, and she's prohibited to the first husband. So she's going to do as much of an investigation as humanly possible before she proceeds on the testimony of a single witness when it's somebody else. But if she is the single witness, she might not be so exacting. Why? Because sometimes she hates her husband. And war is a situation that requires especially careful investigation, and it is tempting for her to rely on the witness, and she is not exacting in her investigation because she really hated that first husband, and so she goes ahead and marries again. And therefore, the testimony of the single witness is not accepted in this case. Rami Bar Chama said, come in here a resolution to this dilemma. Rabbi Akiva said, when I descended to Nehardea in Babylonia to intercalate the year, right, to figure out if we're going to add a leap month in second Adar or not, I found there the sage Nehemiah of Beit Deli. And he said to me, I heard that the sages do not allow a woman to marry in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, right? So the west is Israel, the east in that time was the Jewish community in Bavel, in Babylonia. So this sage in Babylonia is saying to Rabbi Akiva, who traveled there, he says, I heard that the sages in Israel do not allow a woman to marry in Eretz Yisrael based on the testimony of one witness, apart from Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. But the other sages are reluctant to rely on his opinion. And I said to him, yes, this is so. This is Rabbi Akiva speaking. So he said to me, say to them in my name, do you know that this country, Babylonia, is riddled with troops? This is the tradition I received from Rabban Gamliel the elder, that the sages do allow a woman to marry based on one witness. Now the Gemara analyzes this baraisa in relation to our issue. Is if the single witness is the wife herself, do we accept her testimony? Now, what is the significance of Nehemiah's commentary, of Nehemiah's comment that his country is riddled with troops? Isn't he saying, even though this country is riddled with troops, this is the tradition that I received, that the sages do allow a woman to marry based on one witness, notwithstanding the fact that we're at war over here? So apparently one witness is deemed credible in the case of a missing husband, even during wartime. Rava said, if this is how you interpret the matter, in what way is this country different from any other? In other words, why did Nehemiah of Beit Deli mention a particular place? He should have said, any place where there are troops, we rely on the testimony of a single witness. Why was he talking about his own country, that it is riddled with troops? Rather, Rava said, this is what Nehemiah meant. What he was really saying is, you know that this country, Babylonia, is riddled with troops, and I cannot leave the members of my household and travel to Israel and come before the sages to testify about the tradition I received from Rabban Gamliel the elder due to the danger of that journey. So therefore, I cannot testify in person that this is the tradition I received. That the sages allow a woman to marry based on a single witness. Now, according to this interpretation, his statement has no bearing on the matter at hand. According to that interpretation, he's just saying we allow a woman to marry based on the testimony of a single witness. I just can't go and tell them that because this nation is at war. But this doesn't say anything about the question, do we rely on the testimony of the wife that her husband has died if in their journey they were in a land that was at war? So the Gemara continues, come in here a baraisa that relates an incident involving two Torah scholars who were coming with Abba Yosef ben Simai by boat, and that boat sank. And Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi allowed their wives to marry based on the testimony given by these women that their husbands were dead. Now, consider, water, i.e. the sea, is like war with respect to this law, as there is room in both cases for conjecture and error. The men seemed to drown, but you didn't find the body of the dead man, right? It was lost at sea. If somehow a miracle might have been performed and he was saved. You don't know. You're making an assumption that you're probably 99% correct. You're 99% likely to be right, but you could be wrong. So the ocean is like a war. And the women, even 100 of them, are considered as one witness with regard to the testimony about their own husband's death. And yet, the Baraisa taught that he allowed them to marry, which indicates that one may rely on a single witness even during a war. But the Gemara rejects this proof. And how can you understand it that way? Apparently, the women testified only that the boat sank. And this is a case of an endless body of water, as the boat sank at sea in a spot from which it is impossible to see the shore. And the law is that if a man was on a boat that sank in an endless body of water, his wife is prohibited to marry, as there is no proof that he actually drowned and didn't emerge from the water on some other shore. Rather, one must say, what are the circumstances that those women said those drowned men were brought up before us, and we saw them immediately when they came out of the water. And the women stated distinguishing marks that identified those drowned bodies as their husbands. As in this case, we do not actually rely upon the women's testimony, but upon those distinguishing marks of the corpses that washed up out of the water. Now we're on 115b. The Gemara relates there was a certain man who deposited sesame plants with his friend, and sometime later he said to him, "Give me the sesame plants." The friend said to him, "You already took them." The owner replied, "No, my plants were such and such an amount, and they were placed in a barrel. Go and check that barrel, and you will see that I'm right." And the Bailey, the one who's taking care of the plants, said to him, "You took your sesame plants, and these plants that are in the barrel at my house, these are other sesame plants. They're not your sesame plants." So the case came before the sages for a ruling. And Rav Chisda thought to say, this situation is the same as the situation involving the two Torah scholars who were drowned and lost at sea. When they were drowned and their bodies emerged from the sea. And they used distinguishing marks to identify them. And we do not say in that case, those men went elsewhere in the world and these bodies who floated up are different people. So here too, one may rely upon the distinguishing marks of the sesame plants given by the owner, and there is no reason to think that these sesame plants that the friend is holding, who's claiming that they're different plants, there's no reason to believe that they are different plants. They have the distinguishing marks that the owner testified to. So Rava said to Rav Chisda, "Is this comparable?" There they said distinguishing marks that identified the victims. Here, in the case of sesame plants, what distinguishing marks might they have by which they could be identified? And as for that which he said they were of such and such an amount, well, one can say it happened by chance that this second time it was the same amount, maybe the amount of plants that fit in a barrel. And there's no proof that these are the same sesame plants and that this man didn't already take his plants. Now, with regard to the same issue, Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chisda, said to Rav Ashi, "And are we concerned that perhaps the one guarding the plants moved them from their place? But didn't we learn in a Mishna, in Meiser Sheni 4:11, if one found a vessel on which the letter Kuf was written, all objects inside the vessel are designated for a korban, an offering. If the letter Mem was written on it, it is Meiser, tithes. If it was the letter Dalet, it is Dimua, a mixture of teruma and non-sacred produce. If the letter was Tet, it signifies Tevel, untithed produce. And finally, if the letter is Tav, it indicates teruma. As during a time of danger, i.e. when there's religious persecution against the Jews, they would write, for example, Tav instead of teruma, so that the Romans wouldn't identify that the Jews are practicing their religion. So in this case, no concern is expressed that someone might have moved the teruma from that vessel to somewhere else. Now, in response to this claim, Ravina said to Rav Ashi, and aren't we concerned that perhaps someone moved the teruma from their place? Say the latter clause of that same Mishnah, Rabbi Yosef says, even if one found a barrel on which the full word teruma was written, these contents are non-sacred because I say last year it was full of teruma, and someone removed the contents and replaced them with non-sacred produce. And this proves that the possibility that someone moved the original contents is taken into consideration. As you see, they're establishing standards of evidence, standards of proof. Especially in a case where a woman remarrying when her husband turns out to still be alive, it's such a high stakes question. It's not only that she might remarry and have to divorce the second husband, but rather, if it turns out that her first husband was still alive and she remarried, well, that second marriage was not a marriage. And if they had children, those children are mamzers who will be prohibited from marrying other Jews. So they have to be so careful. And if there's room to say, your assumption is maybe a pretty good assumption, but it is not 100% one we can rely on because, there's all these cracks in the story, as it were. Just like in this case of the plants that could have been replaced or the tides that could have been replaced, we have to be so careful. So rather, say as follows. Everyone agrees that we are concerned that perhaps someone moved the contents of a container from their place. And here, with regard to the marked vessels, they disagree about this issue. The sage who claims that one may rely on the inscription holds that if it is so that he moved the teruma, he would have erased the inscription. And the other sage, Rabbi Yosef, responds that no, one can say he forgot to change the inscription. Alternatively, he left the label to preserve the contents so that people would mistakenly think that it contained teruma and would refrain from taking the produce. What is that? Yeah, I think there's like a joke that they tell about a yeshiva, where everyone is like, very religious people learning all day long, studying God's law, praying, together in the yeshiva. But one of the students, liked to have some milk with his coffee, and he would put it in the communal refrigerator. And then when it was time to drink his coffee, other people had drunk his milk. And he could never get the milk for his coffee. So he put a sign, please don't drink my milk. It's for my coffee. But people kept drinking the milk. He said, come on, guys. This is a yeshiva. It is stealing to take my milk. And they would still take his milk. And he tried every kind of warning about the transgression that people are committing if they drink his milk. And still they were drinking his milk. And so then he said, this milk is not kosher. And then nobody drank the milk. Works better in a yeshiva context. In fact, I think the real joke for the insiders who get it is he said, this milk is not chol of Yisrael. Whatever. Well, let's move on. I know Nina's groaning right now that I killed a joke. Okay. So where am I? From taking the produce. Okay. New subject. The Gemara relates a story that deals with the permission of a woman to remarry. Yitzchak, the exilarch, the son of the sister of Rav Bevi, was walking from Kortva to Spain, and he died along the way. What's the exilarch? That's the head of the Jewish community in Babylonia or in some other place, but usually we're talking about in Babylonia. So they sent this message from Spain. Yitzchak, the exilarch, the son of the sister of Rav Bevi, was walking from Kortva to Spain, and he died. It seems like they sent the message reflecting exactly what happened. So the Gemara asks, are we concerned about the possibility that there are two men named Yitzchak or not? Even though it says Yitzchak, the exilarch, the son of the sister of Rav Bevi. But are we concerned that there might be two men named Yitzchak? Perhaps there's someone else with the same name, and therefore the mention of his name is not a sufficiently distinguishing mark. Abaye said, no, we're not concerned about this possibility. And Abaye said, we are concerned about this possibility. And Rava said, we are not concerned. Abaye said, from where do I say my reasoning that there might be another man with the same name? Now, I'm confused about this, because if they said that Yitzchak from Babylonia died, I would understand the concern. But if they said Yitzchak, the exilarch, the son of the sister of Rav Bevai, was walking, I mean, why isn't that distinguishing marks enough? But okay. Now Abaye says why he says there's room for error. We can't be sure. Why? Because there was another incident. Here's the story within the story. A certain bill of divorce was once found in the city of Nehardea, and this passage was written on it. On the colonial side of the city, I, Androlinai of Nehardea, excused, sent away, and divorced my wife, so-and-so. Androlinai's wife requested permission from the court to remarry based on this bill of divorce. But they did not know if he was the man who gave the divorce or if it was given by another man of the same name. And the father of Shmuel, right, who is a sage himself, sent this question before Rabbi Yehuda Nisiah, he's the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, in Eretz Yisrael, and Rabbi Yehuda Nisiah sent a message to him. All of Nehardea must be examined to see whether or not there is another man by the same name. Now this shows that one must be concerned that there might be two people with the same name. And maybe what it is that even though they identified him as Yitzhak, the exilarch, the son of the sister, blah, 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 maybe all they heard from him was that his name is Yitzhak from Babylonia, and that's all they knew, but they had heard of Yitzhak, the exilarch, and it was the people who sent the message who assumed that this is the exilarch, the son of the sister of Rabbeva, etc., but all they really knew about him was that his name was Yitzhak. Right? So now you can see that Abaye is not so crazy. Maybe there is a good reason to doubt this testimony. Rava said this story about the fact that they examined every man in Nehardea to see if there was any other Androlinai who might have divorced his wife provides no proof about whether or not we can accept the testimony about Yitzhak, the exilarch, who died in Spain. Why? Because if it is so that there were grounds to suspect that someone else of the same name wrote the bill of divorce, Rabbi Yehuda Nisiah should have said, the entire world must be examined to know that we have the correct Androlinai, in case there is someone else with the same name in some other city and he moved there. Since Rabbi Yehuda Nisiah did not say this, evidently there was no legitimate reason for this suspicion at all. Why then did Rabbi Yehuda Nisiah say that you must examine every man in Nehardea to see if there's another man named Androlinai who might have divorced his wife? Why did he say that? Rather, it was due to respect for the father of Shmuel that he sent this message. He did not want to write explicitly that Shmuel's father had asked a silly question and that he had inquired unnecessarily. And therefore, he wrote his reply in a manner that showed respect to Shmuel's father and said, well, I can see why you're concerned. We're not really concerned. So do a little local examination just to be sure. Oh, sorry I didn't give warning. That's the end of what we're covering today. There's a much shorter daf. I'll take questions and comments now, and we'll pick this up tomorrow with page 116, God willing, at the regular Friday time, which is noon Pacific. And by the way, I'll mention now, you always see the picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe behind me. And the Lubavitcher Rebbe's yard site is this Shabbos, Gimel Tammuz, the third of the Hebrew month of Tammuz. And on our weekly bulletin, we shared a beautiful meme and a saying, a quote of the Rebbe and a little bit of his story and the unbelievable impact on the Jewish world that the Rebbe and his work and his mission accomplished in the 20th century. I mean, it's just unbelievable how he transformed the Jewish world by sending his emissaries and like every other Hasidic group, is mostly focused on maintaining their own traditions by sort of circling the wagons and keeping everything tight and close and keeping the influences of the world at bay. But the Rebbe said, no, we have to send our people out into the world to make Judaism and Torah available to every Jew in the world, no matter where she or he is. It's an extraordinary accomplishment. And, it's just touched so many Jews and so many non-Jews around the world. What a leader that not only showed tremendous leadership, but created leaders. That is the truest leader. Okay, let's see what questions and comments we've got. On Yevamos, page 115. Oh, what a good question from Sharon. In the case of the single witness that a woman relies on, a single witness comes from overseas and says that he saw this woman's husband dead. And so there's only one witness. No other witness comes forward. She investigates as best as she can. There's just no other way to find any evidence. She comes to the court. She says, we only have this single witness. I do want to remarry. It's been years that my husband has disappeared. So I'll take the risk. The court says, okay, go ahead and marry. And she marries her second husband. And then years later, the first husband shows up. And as we discussed, in that situation, she has to divorce the second husband, and she becomes prohibited to the first husband. She can't be married to either of them. Sharon is asking, can she marry some other guy, a third guy? My understanding is yes, because at that point, she has a divorce from the first husband, which she didn't have at the time she married the second husband. They make the second husband give her a bill of divorce, even though that marriage was never a marriage, because they relied on it to some extent from, as a matter of public policy. They make him give her a bill of divorce too, just in case there was any doubt. So she is definitely now not married to anyone, and she can go and marry some other guy and have a third marriage. That's my understanding. Bill, I see the sages went to the Matryoshka doll school of storytelling. I guess the embedded dolls within dolls within dolls, right? The Russian dolls. I like it. And Louis Gombach, who is not Louis Gombach, right? That was Kate? Using maybe your friend. Karen in Northern California. Huh? How's that for memory? Not totally dead yet. Karen asks, the son of the sister of. Isn't it unusual to identify someone by his mother rather than his father? Is it because his mother's brother was famous? Fantastic question. I think that sometimes they will do it for that reason, exactly, because the mother's family contains a sage in it and they would want to be associated with him. And sometimes it's because, the mother was taken, shall we say, in wartime by a non-Jew, but was able to raise her child, to be a Torah Jew and even a Torah scholar. So in that situation, he's not going to be identified with the non-Jewish father who was maybe not part of his life at all. He's going to be identified with the mother. And there are some other sages that have that same kind of lineage in their name that we've seen other cases like that. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together tomorrow on Erev Shabbos at the noon Pacific time for the next page. Have a terrific night, a good Chodesh. May this month of Tammuz, which is normally thought of as a time of increasing darkness, because the 17th of Tammuz is when we start the 3 weeks, the countdown to the 9th of Av in the following month, when the two temples were destroyed and many other tragedies happened in Jewish history. That this is a time of increasing darkness when the enemies of Israel are sort of empowered to harm Israel. But as Rabbi Wolf taught us this morning, during these times of increasing darkness, since everything comes from God, we learn that the darkest moments contain within them the seeds of the greatest light. We see that in Jewish history. Most recently, for example, the Holocaust, perhaps the darkest moment in all of Jewish history, but it contained within it the seeds of the modern state of Israel. Rabbi Wolf said, but take that lesson inside on a personal basis. Our own darkest places, those places that we don't want to examine. We know we did something terrible, or we know we have a terrible desire, or we know we have an addiction, places that we just don't even want to examine. If we ask for God to face our darkest places and to strengthen us to work out what is in those darkest places and to change our behavior from that work and that examination, from that very place will issue the greatest light.